Family and fellow soldiers, I'm the Professor, and this is the Moment of Truth. And now the Friday Crime Report. Denver, Colorado, Wednesday, August 5th, 2020, 2:40 a.m. Summer of 2020, while the pandemic was raging and people were in the streets protesting the murder of George Floyd, there was another heinous hate crime that had also taken place that year. In the early morning hours, firefighters responded to a fire raging at 5312 North Truckee Street. The home was inhabited by a family of immigrants from Senegal. 3 people living in the house jumped from the second floor and survived without life-threatening injuries. Unfortunately, 5 other people in the house didn't survive. The 3 adult victims were ages 29, 23, and 25. Among the dead were also 2 baby girls, ages 2 and 6 months old. From the very beginning, the authorities went out of their way to avoid using the phrase hate crime, and this would be a denial that would be ongoing for the police throughout this entire investigation and case. A GoFundMe was set up to help the family pay for funeral expenses. The police eventually called it arson, of course, and they did the usual plea to the public for anyone to come forward and solve the case for them. The Denver police only bothered to offer a measly $14,000 for any information leading to an arrest. 5 people burned to death, 2 of them babies, and they thought that was only worth $14,000. A couple of weeks after this act of mass murder, police released images of the suspects taken from a surveillance camera. They were shown wearing white masks and dark hoodies. Police also released an image of the car believed to have been used in the massacre, a dark 4-door sedan. This, of course, didn't yield much. Finally, in November of 2020, the Denver police engaged in an accidental act of investigation. They applied for what the white media has characterized as a controversial search warrant. It's called a reverse keyword search warrant. It relies on requiring Google to turn over the account information for any users who search for particular keywords in a particular time frame. In this case, Denver police asked Google to give them a list of any users who had searched for the victim's home address in the 15 days leading up to the fire. The search warrant led to the arrest of the murderers. Google provided the search histories for the suspects dating back to July 1st, 2020. The histories showed the suspects had searched for the targeted address prior to the fire, and it also showed searches for news stories relating to the fire in the hours after the crime. So they were celebrating the mass murder they had committed. Police also used the criminals' Snapchat location data to place them at the scene of the slaughter. The first person they connected to this mass murder was 16-year-old Kevin Bowie. They also would arrest another 16-year-old, Gavin Seymour, as well as 14-year-old Dylan Siebert. Bowie and Seymour were charged as adults. The Denver District Attorney's Office charged Bowie and Seymour with 60 felony counts, including first-degree murder, attempted murder, first-degree and second-degree assault, first- and fourth-degree arson, first- and second-degree burglary, conspiracy charges, and other sentencing enhancers. So these 2 creeps got hit with dozens of charges each. Keep that in mind, you'll be seeing that again later. Though it does bear noting that no sooner than the arrests were made, the police chief decided to tell the white media that it wasn't a hate crime. There hadn't been a trial, the investigation wasn't even concluded yet, and he was already saying this wasn't a hate crime. Gee, does anyone get the feeling that the fix was in? Seymour's attorneys tried to get the search warrant thrown out. They argued that it violated Seymour's Fourth Amendment rights, but the Colorado Supreme Court upheld the use of the warrant. Now, when it comes to indicting rappers for their lyrics, that's never characterized as controversial by the white media. The all-in laws, which are mostly used to prosecute black people, aren't controversial either. But to go after suspects using digital technology because they killed some black folks, well, that is controversial. And to be fair, the Colorado authorities are no doubt already planning how they can use these keyword warrants to go after black people. So let's be real about this. They didn't do this to do us any favors. Now, you won't be surprised to learn that this wasn't Kevin Bowie's first foray into criminality. In fact, it runs in his family. Kevin Bowie's also a drug dealer who worked with another drug dealer, his sister Tanya. Shortly after her degenerate brother was arrested, Tanya Bowie would be arrested by the feds, and she got charged with drugs and gun trafficking charges, as well as accused of having been involved in the planning for the arson murder that her brother committed. As a federal magistrate put it, for a 23-year-old to own a Tesla Model S worth $80,000 who has no reported income from legitimate employment is very strange. It is also strange that you'd own a $20,000 Lexus. So the headlines about Kevin Bowie should have read, drug dealing criminal charged with arson that kills 5. In February of 2022, Tanya Bowie pleaded guilty to possession of fentanyl with intent to distribute, as well as possession of a firearm in furtherance of a drug trafficking offense. In July of 2022, she became the first of this criminal band to go to prison, being sentenced to 10 years in the federal pen. Prosecutors had all of these killers dead to rights with airtight cases. The only way that these guys don't go to prison for multiple life sentences would be if the prosecutors just suddenly decided to drop all the charges. Which is what they did. In February of 2023, Dylan Siebert was sentenced to 7 years in district court, as well as a suspended sentence of 26 years. So he takes part in murdering 5 people, including 2 babies, and destroying a home, and he gets the kind of sentence someone gets for drunk driving. As for Gavin Seymour, remember those 60-plus charges that he got hit with? Well, prosecutors decided that 59 of them were a little bit too much, so they handed him a plea deal for a mere second-degree murder charge. And as for the dozens of other charges, they just dismissed them as part of his plea deal. In March of this year, he was sentenced to only 40 years in prison. He committed 5 acts of premeditated murder, with 2 of his victims being babies, and he only has to plead to 1 second-degree murder charge. This month, Kevin Bowie was sentenced to 60 years. He only had to plead guilty to 2 second-degree murder charges instead of the 5 premeditated murders he actually committed. His 60-plus other charges were also dismissed, and prosecutors went beyond that. They even dismissed a drug case that he had picked up while he was in jail, helping to traffic drugs with his sister. So they basically threw away the entire case, which is what normally happens when there's an anti-black hate crime. This animal was allowed to get away with murdering 2 babies and 3 adults, and prosecutors refused to bring the cases, not because they didn't have the evidence, not because they didn't think they could win, but because they actually agreed with and supported his vile act. Trash like this are the irregular forces of white supremacy, and this racist system is dedicated to protecting them. One of the supporters of the Senagalese family said that the sentences these murderers got wasn't justice. Well, that's an understatement. Rather than the multiple life sentences without parole that they should have gotten, that they automatically would have gotten had they been black, prosecutors instead threw their entire cases away, literally dozens of charges that they had these creeps dead to rights on. Colorado doesn't have the death penalty. But even if it did, do you seriously believe that these prosecutors would have actually gone for it? Now you're probably wondering, what reason did these reprobates give for their animalistic actions? The police say that Kevin Bowie believed someone had stolen his cell phone. He used some app to try to locate it, but allegedly he tracked it to the wrong house. This story is suspect as hell, by the way. I don't buy it. If all he wanted was his cell phone and he thought that he had a location on it, then all he had to do was contact the police. That's if he wanted the cell phone back. But he made no attempt to actually get this alleged stolen cell phone back. Instead, he just set fire to the house of complete strangers. So this wasn't about some cell phone. This was just a typical act of evil committed by a typical evil person. We know evil when we see it. But of course the white media doesn't, and these racist prosecutors certainly don't. Some people think that there's this overarching solidarity among immigrants. If you look at the congressional black talkers, you see a lot of individuals like that. But the problem is when people come from anti-black cultures, they identify with the white supremacists. And they'll go overboard trying to prove just how dedicated they are to that proposition, especially if they feel that there's a racial pecking order in the society that favors them over black people. And keep in mind, these little terrorists who did this, these are Gen Zers here, born in 2004, and yet look at what they did. This is what's being taught in the homes of America. On a side note, the president of Senegal actually tweeted about this incident, and he even sent the Senegalese consul general to Denver to look into the investigation. Now, these African leaders don't lift a finger to help their own people at home, but they hear about something like this in the U.S., and the first thing they think is they can use it to boost their own profiles, and here we go. When Barack Obama became president, he didn't do anything for Kenya, and yet the Kenyan government and even its people were literally dancing in the streets on his behalf. They were happy over something. You know, a lot of black people, particularly those of an immigrant background, try to tell themselves that white supremacy looks at them differently. They stay away from black Americans, they claim to work harder, and all of that, and for many of them the illusion seems to hold. But reality always gets the last word, and sooner or later they get that wake-up call. And when they do, they suddenly discover racism actually exists. You know, some people need to grow up and realize the reality of the world they live in. Because if they choose to stay asleep, the wake-up call they get could take the form of a 5-alarm fire. And that's this week's Friday Crime Report. Keep your eyes open and stay on alert, because there's a lot worse criminals out there than the ones the white corporate media chooses to show you. Good day, and be one. I'd like to take a moment to mention some of our contributors: Richard Mitchell, Minnie FBA, Tom Anderson, Tamara Williams, and Daryl. Salute to them and thank you to everyone for listening, liking, and sharing this message. Black empowerment only exists because of you.